My name is Dorothy Brennan, and I'm 71 years old. And 3 hours ago, I walked out of my son's wedding reception carrying a box of photographs that changed everything. I'm sitting in my car outside the Willowbrook Country Club right now, my hands still trembling as I stare at these pictures that revealed a truth so devastating it shattered 35 years of what I thought was unconditional love. The parking lot is nearly empty now, the celebration continuing inside without me, and I can't decide whether to laugh or cry at the cruel irony of it all. Before we dive back in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is something truly special I can't wait to share. You see, my son, Tyler, had told me just this morning, "Mom, maybe just come for the ceremony only. The reception might be overwhelming for you." Overwhelming for me. The woman who had raised him single-handedly after his father died when Tyler was only 7. The woman who had worked 3 jobs to put him through law school. The woman who had mortgaged her house to help him start his practice. But what happened at that reception, what I discovered about my own son and the family I thought I knew, was so shocking that I had to leave. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because I finally understood that I had been living a lie for years. Let me take you back to this morning, when I woke up in my small cottage in Maplewood, thinking today would be the proudest day of my life. I had been awake since 4 a.m., too excited to sleep. Today was the day my Tyler would marry Penelope Ashworth, the daughter of one of the most prominent families in Riverside County. I stood in my bedroom, carefully pressing the lavender dress I'd bought specifically for this occasion. Not too flashy, God forbid I should draw attention, but elegant enough that Penelope's society friends couldn't whisper about Tyler's mother looking cheap. The dress had cost me 3 months of grocery money, but it was Tyler's wedding, my only child's wedding. Nothing was too much. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, a text from Tyler. "Morning, Mom. Looking forward to seeing you today. Remember what we talked about yesterday." What we talked about yesterday. The conversation that had left me feeling smaller than I'd felt in years, but which I'd rationalized away because that's what mothers do. We make excuses for our children's behavior long after they've stopped being children. Tyler had called me into his office the day before, the one I'd helped him furnish when he was just starting out. He sat behind his mahogany desk looking every inch like the successful attorney, while I perched on the edge of the client chair like a supplicant. "Mom, about tomorrow," he had begun, his voice taking on that professional tone he used with difficult clients. "Penelope's family has certain expectations." Expectations? That word again. The same word that had been cropping up in our conversations ever since he'd gotten engaged to Penelope 2 years ago. "I understand, honey," I'd said, though I didn't really. Not then. "The thing is," Tyler continued, adjusting his tie nervously, "the reception is going to be quite formal. Lots of Penelope's father's business associates, political connections, that sort of crowd." I nodded, waiting for him to get to the point. "So, we were thinking maybe you could just come for the ceremony part. The reception might be a bit overwhelming for you. You know how these society events can be?" Overwhelming for me? As if I hadn't spent my entire adult life navigating challenging situations? As if I hadn't built a successful catering business from nothing after his father died? As if I hadn't rubbed shoulders with wealthy clients for decades, learning their mannerisms, their expectations, their unspoken rules. But I smiled and nodded because that's what I always did with Tyler. "Of course, sweetheart, whatever makes you most comfortable." "It's not about my comfort, Mom," he said quickly, though we both knew that wasn't true. "It's just that Penelope's family are very particular about appearances, and you know how you sometimes get when you're nervous. You talk a lot about the old days, about Dad, about the catering business. these people might not relate to those stories. Those stories. The stories of how I kept us afloat after his father's sudden heart attack. How I started making sandwiches for the local deli at 5 a.m. before taking him to school, then working at the bank all day, then catering small events in the evenings. And how every single sacrifice I had made had been for him, to give him opportunities I never had. Those stories were apparently embarrassing now. I understand, I'd repeated, because what else could I say? That his father would have been ashamed of the man Tyler had become? That the little boy who used to help me in the kitchen, who used to be so proud to tell his friends that his mom owned her own business, had grown into someone who was ashamed of where he came from?
Now, standing in my bedroom at 5 a.m. on his wedding day, I tried to push down the hurt and focus on the joy. This was my son's wedding day. I would be gracious, supportive, and unobtrusive. I would come for the ceremony and then quietly disappear so that Tyler could enjoy his reception without the embarrassment of his working-class mother. The ceremony was at 2 p.m. at St. Augustine's Chapel, the historic stone church where Penelope's family had been married for generations. I arrived early, clutching my small purse and the envelope containing my wedding gift, a check for $25,000, which represented the last of my retirement savings. Tyler and Penelope were planning to buy a house, and I wanted to help with the down payment, just as my own mother had helped me and Robert when we were young. I took my assigned seat in the third row behind Penelope's extended family and their friends. Tyler had explained that the front rows were reserved for immediate family, and since Penelope's family was so large, there wasn't room for me there. "You'll have a great view from row 3, Mom," he'd assured me, "maybe even better than the front." As the chapel filled, I watched Penelope's relatives take their places. Designer dresses, expensive jewelry, the easy confidence that comes with generational wealth. I smoothed my lavender dress and reminded myself that I belonged here too. I was the mother of the groom. I had every right to be proud. But as the ceremony began and I watched my son standing at the altar, handsome in his tailored tuxedo, I felt like I was watching a stranger. When had the gap between us grown so wide? When had I become someone he needed to manage rather than celebrate? The ceremony was beautiful. Tyler's vows were eloquent, filled with promises about building a life worthy of Penelope's love, about honoring her family's traditions, about creating a future that would make them all proud. He spoke about gratitude for the opportunities he'd been given, about the importance of family legacy, about stepping into his role as husband with the dignity the occasion demanded. He never once looked at me during those vows. Not once. After the ceremony, during the receiving line, Tyler hugged me briefly. "Thanks for coming, Mom. It means everything to have you here." "I wouldn't have missed it for the world," I said, pressing the envelope into his hands. "A little something to help with the house." He glanced at the envelope, and for just a moment, his professional mask slipped. "Mom, you didn't have to." "I wanted to," I said firmly. "It's what family does." Penelope appeared at his elbow then, radiant in her $1,000 dress. "Mrs. Brennan, thank you so much for coming. The ceremony was perfect, wasn't it?" "Beautiful," I agreed. "You make a lovely couple." "We certainly think so," she laughed, already looking past me to the next person in line. "Tyler, darling, the Ashworths are waiting." And just like that, I was dismissed. Tyler squeezed my hand. "Thanks again, Mom. Drive safely." I stood there for a moment, watching them greet this seemingly endless line of well-wishers, and felt the full weight of my exclusion. This was it. My part in my son's wedding day was over. Time for me to quietly disappear so the real celebration could begin. But as I walked toward my car, something made me stop. Maybe it was the finality of it all, or maybe it was the realization that if I left now, I might never truly understand how wide the chasm between Tyler and I had grown. Whatever it was, I found myself walking back toward the country club instead of away from it. That decision, to turn around, to stay, to see what I wasn't supposed to see, that's what led to this moment. Sitting in my car with a box of photographs that revealed a truth so devastating
It changed everything I thought I knew about my son, my family, and myself. Because what I discovered at that reception, what those photographs showed me, wasn't just that Tyler was ashamed of me. It was something far worse than that. Something that made me realize I'd been enabling a lie for years, and that the biggest shock of all wasn't what Tyler had done to me. It was what I was about to do to him. It took a lot of care and time to prepare and narrate this for you, so if you're enjoying it, a quick subscribe really helps and means the world to us. All right, let's get back to it. Looking back now, with those devastating photographs still scattered across my passenger seat, I can see how blind I'd been to the pattern. The signs had been there for years, growing more obvious with each passing month since Tyler announced his engagement to Penelope. But like most mothers, I'd made excuses, rationalized away the hurt, and convinced myself that my son was just trying to fit into a world that was foreign to both of us. I should have seen it coming. The first red flag appeared 18 months ago when Tyler brought Penelope to my house for Sunday dinner, a tradition we'd maintained since he was in college. I'd spent the entire weekend preparing his favorite meal, pot roast with vegetables, homemade dinner rolls, and my famous apple pie that had won the Maplewood County Fair 3 years running. Penelope had walked into my modest kitchen, her designer heels clicking against the linoleum floor I'd installed myself 15 years earlier. She surveyed the space with barely concealed disdain. The avocado green appliances I couldn't afford to replace, the family photos covering the refrigerator, the ceramic roosters I'd collected over the years because they reminded me of my grandmother's kitchen. "How charming," she'd said, her voice dripping with the kind of false sweetness that wealthy people use when they encounter something they consider quaint. "It's so authentic, like a museum of Americana." Tyler had laughed nervously. "Mom's always been practical about decorating, right, Mom? Function over form." I'd smiled and nodded, but something in his tone stung. When had my home become something that needed defending? When had the space where I'd raised him, where we'd celebrated every birthday and holiday, become a source of embarrassment? During dinner, Penelope had picked at her food while regaling us with stories about their family's estate in the Hamptons, their winter home in Aspen, and her recent trip to Europe with her sorority sisters. Every anecdote was designed to highlight the vast difference between her world and mine. "Tyler tells me you have a catering business," she'd said, cutting her pot roast into tiny pieces she never actually ate. "That must be so fulfilling, cooking for people." "It is," I'd replied proudly. "I've built quite a reputation in the county. The Morrison wedding last spring had 300 guests, and the Historical Society always requests me for their fundraising galas." "How wonderful that you can make a living doing what you love," Penelope had responded, but her tone suggested she viewed catering as barely a step above food service. Though I imagine it must be exhausting, all that standing and heavy lifting. Tyler had jumped in quickly. "Mom's always been talking about scaling back, haven't you, Mom? Maybe focusing more on smaller, intimate events." I hadn't been talking about scaling back at all. Business was better than ever, and I loved the creative challenge of planning elaborate events. But Tyler's suggestion hung in the air like a verdict. My successful business was somehow inappropriate for the mother of his future wife. The pattern continued through their engagement. When they announced their plans at the Riverside Country Club, a venue that required a $50,000 initiation fee just to join, I wasn't included in the announcement party. Tyler called me afterward explaining that it was just immediate family and a few close friends. "But I am immediate family," I'd pointed out gently. "Of course you are, Mom. It's just that Penelope's parents wanted to keep it small, and you know how you sometimes feel overwhelmed in those kinds of social situations." I'd never expressed feeling overwhelmed in social situations. In fact, my catering business required me to navigate high society events regularly. But somehow, Tyler had convinced himself that I was fragile, unsophisticated, unable to handle his new social circle.
The wedding planning process had been a masterclass in subtle exclusion. Every major decision was made without my input, then presented to me as a fait accompli. The venue, the menu, the flowers, the music, all chosen by Penelope and her mother, Constance Ainsworth, a woman who treated wedding planning like a military campaign designed to showcase her family's superior taste and connections. Mrs. Brennan, Constance had said during our one and only planning meeting, "We've taken care of all the details. We know how busy you must be with your little business, so we didn't want to burden you with decisions about things like china patterns and flower arrangements." My little business. The enterprise that had supported Tyler through law school, that had allowed me to help him with his first apartment deposit, that had funded countless gifts and support over the years, reduced to a little business that apparently disqualified me from having opinions about my own son's wedding. But I'd swallowed my pride because Tyler seemed happy. When I watched him with Penelope at family gatherings, he seemed more confident, more polished. She was helping him network, introducing him to influential people, opening doors that my connections never could. If distancing himself from me was the price of that success, maybe it was worth it. The financial requests had started small. A loan to help with the engagement ring, $8,000 for a diamond that Penelope deemed appropriate for her family's expectations. Then came the bachelor party in Las Vegas, $3,500 for Tyler's share of a weekend that included private jets and high-end entertainment. The wedding suit required custom tailoring, another $2,000. Each request came with the promise of repayment once things settled down after the wedding. I'd given freely, even when it meant dipping into my retirement savings. Tyler was investing in his future, and an extension in our family's future. When he made partner at his law firm, when they and Penelope had children, all of this sacrifice would be worth it. The breaking point should have come 3 months ago during the engagement party I was finally invited to attend. Penelope's father, Harrison Ainsworth, had stood before the assembled guests, prominent businessmen, politicians, social leaders, and delivered a toast that completely erased my existence from Tyler's life story. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrison had begun, his voice carrying the authority of old money and older connections, "we gather tonight to celebrate not just the union of two remarkable young people, but the merging of two families with shared values and aspirations."
My phone buzzed with a text from my assistant, Zara. "Emergency at the party? Just got word from building security that someone's been asking questions about Nexus ownership. Want me to handle it?" My stomach dropped. Someone at tonight's party was investigating Nexus innovations? The timing couldn't be coincidental. I quickly typed back, "Who's asking?" Marcus Chen, from Portland Tech Weekly, says he's working on a story about anonymous tech founders. Should I shut this down? Marcus Chen. The same journalist Trevor had invited to cover our engagement party was also investigating the identity behind Nexus Innovations. The journalist who was here at Jade's suggestion, taking photos of an event at a venue owned by the very company he was trying to expose. The pieces clicked together with horrible clarity. This wasn't just about Trevor showcasing his agency to industry contacts. Someone suspected the connection between me and Nexus, and they were using my own engagement party to investigate. I typed back quickly, "Do we know who tipped him off?" The response came immediately. "Working on it, but Camille, if someone's connecting dots, tonight could get complicated fast." I stared at my phone, my mind racing through possibilities. Had I been too careless? Had someone at Walsh Creative put together the pieces? Or was this pure coincidence, a journalist following leads that happened to intersect with my carefully guarded secret? Through the terrace doors, I could see Trevor and Jade still conferring in the main hall, their body language intimate despite the professional context.
Guests would be arriving soon for a party that no longer resembled anything I'd planned, in a venue they didn't know I owned, while a journalist hunted for information that could destroy the anonymity I'd spent years protecting. The irony was breathtaking. I'd been planning to tell Trevor the truth tonight, after the party, in the privacy of our apartment, as a gift of trust and transparency. Instead, I might be forced to reveal everything publicly, defensively, in front of industry peers and press who would dissect every detail of my deception. My phone rang. Zara again. "We have a problem," she said without preamble. "Chen's not just investigating randomly. Someone provided him with specific information about Nexus's property holdings, including the Cascade Ballroom. He knows you're connected to tonight's event." Someone fed him information? My voice was barely a whisper. That's what it looks like. Professional-grade intel, not casual speculation. Camille, someone's actively trying to expose you, and they're using your engagement party to do it. I closed my eyes, feeling the carefully constructed walls of my double life crumbling around me. After 2 years of protecting Trevor's ego by hiding my success, someone else had decided to detonate my secret for their own purposes. "Zara," I said, my voice steadying with resolution. "Activate Protocol 7. There was a pause. Protocol 7 was our emergency transparency plan, complete documentation of my ownership and achievements, prepared for legal protection but never used. "You're sure?" she asked. I looked through the doors at Trevor, still absorbed in conversation with Jade, oblivious to the fact that his networking event was about to become the site of the biggest revelation in Portland's tech scene this year. "Someone wants to expose me tonight. Fine, but they're going to get more truth than they bargained for." As I ended the call and prepared to return to the party, I realized that the careful conversation I'd planned for later tonight had just become impossible. If Marcus Chen was going to reveal my identity anyway, at least I could control the narrative. Trevor had spent months dismissing my business acumen, letting his ex-girlfriend redesign our engagement party, and treating me like a charming accessory to his real ambitions. He wanted to network with Portland's tech elite tonight? Perfect, because he was about to discover he'd been sleeping next to the biggest name in the room. The only question now was whether his ego could survive learning that his supportive little consultant fiancé was actually the anonymous CEO every tech executive in Portland wanted to meet. Somehow, I doubted it. When I returned to the ballroom, guests had begun arriving in earnest. The space buzzed with conversation as Portland's tech elite mingled under the crystal chandeliers, champagne flutes catching the light. I moved through the crowd with new eyes, recognizing faces from industry events where I had remained carefully in the background, watching executives who had no idea they were celebrating in a venue owned by the very company he was trying to expose. Trevor was in his element, working the room with Jade at his side like they were hosting together. I watched him introduce her to David Kim, CEO of Portland's fastest-growing startup accelerator, and felt my jaw clench as she laughed at something David said, her hand touching Trevor's arm in a gesture too intimate for any professional relationship. "Camille!" Marcus Chen appeared at my elbow, notebook in hand and camera around his neck. "We haven't met properly. Marcus Chen, Portland Tech Weekly. Trevor's been telling me about your consulting work." My pulse quickened. This was the journalist investigating Nexus Innovations, now standing inches away from me. "Has he? And what exactly has Trevor told you about my work?" Marcus smiled, but his eyes were calculating. "That you run a small tech consulting firm. Modest operation," he said. "But I'm always interested in the entrepreneurial ecosystem here. What kind of clients do you work with?"
But it was what they were saying, not what they were doing, that made my blood run cold. "God, I thought she'd never leave," Penelope was saying, holding up her phone to take a selfie with Tyler. I was starting to worry we'd have to actually include her in some of the photos. Tyler laughed, that same laugh I'd been drawn to moments earlier. I know, right? I felt bad for a second when she handed me that envelope, but honestly, it's probably better this way. Can you imagine the looks if she'd been sitting at the head table? "Your mother means well," said James Ashworth, Penelope's younger brother, "but she's just so common. The way she talks about that catering business like it's something impressive." $25,000, though, Penelope added, examining her nails. "Not bad for someone who probably thinks that's a fortune. What did you tell her it was for again?" "Down payment on a house," Tyler replied casually, straightening his boutonniere. She ate it up, kept going on about family helping family and all that sentimental garbage. My hands began to shake. They weren't planning to buy a house. Tyler and Penelope were moving into a penthouse apartment that Harrison Ashworth had purchased for them as a wedding gift, a penthouse I'd heard them discussing during the engagement party, worth over $2 million. "Speaking of your mother," said Rebecca Walsh, one of Penelope's bridesmaids, "did you see her face when you told her she couldn't bring a guest? I thought she might actually cry." "She probably wanted to bring some old woman from her quilting circle or whatever. Could you imagine? We'd have had to explain who she was to everyone." "The best part," Tyler continued, and I could hear the cruelty creeping into his voice, "is that she actually thanked me for letting her come to the ceremony, like it was some kind of privilege I was granting her." The group erupted in laughter, and I felt something inside me break apart. Not break like fragile glass, but break like a dam that had been holding back years of accumulated hurt and disappointment. "Tyler," said Christopher Montgomery, another groomsman, "come on, you've really outdone yourself. Most guys have to deal with embarrassing relatives at their weddings, but you managed to neutralize the problem completely?" "It wasn't that hard," Tyler replied, and his tone was so matter-of-fact, so clinical, that I barely recognized my own son's voice. "You just have to manage expectations from the beginning, set boundaries, make it clear what's appropriate and what isn't." "Brilliant strategy," James agreed. "Though I have to ask, what happens now? I mean, you can't keep her locked away forever." Tyler and Penelope exchanged a look that spoke volumes. "We're planning to move to Harrison's place in Connecticut after the honeymoon. Much better social opportunities there. Tyler can transfer to the firm's New York office." "And your mother?" Rebecca asked. "What about her?" Tyler shrugged. "She's got her little business, her little house, her little life. We'll visit for holidays, maybe. Send cards on her birthday. The usual family obligations." Family obligations. That's what I had become to my son. An obligation to be managed with minimal effort and maximum convenience for him. But Christopher wasn't finished. "Come on, Tyler, don't you feel even a little guilty? The woman raised you alone, put you through school. I mean, my parents drive me crazy, but at least I acknowledge what they've done for me." For a moment, Tyler's expression flickered, and I thought I might see a glimpse of the boy I'd raised. But then his face hardened again. "Look, I'm grateful for what she did, but that doesn't mean I have to be trapped by it forever. She made her choices. I'm making mine. She wanted me to be successful, right? Well, this is what success looks like." "Success," I whispered to myself, the word tasting bitter in my mouth. That's when Penelope pulled out her phone again, but this time it wasn't for selfies. "Oh, I have to show you guys something hilarious," she said, scrolling through her photos. "Remember when Tyler brought his mother to our engagement party at the club?" She held up her phone, and the group crowded around to look. I couldn't see what was on the screen from my hiding spot, but their reactions told me everything I needed to know. "Oh my God, is she actually talking to the waitstaff like they're her friends?" Rebecca gasped. "Tyler said she asked the bartender about his family, wanted to know if he had kids, where he went to school. It was mortifying." "And look at this one," Penelope continued, swiping to another photo. "She's actually helping clear plates at a country club event, like she thinks she's at some church potluck."
The laughter that followed was like acid in my ears. They had been photographing my humiliation, collecting evidence of my social missteps, like specimens to be studied and mocked later. But then Penelope pulled out her phone again. But this time, it wasn't for selfies. "Oh, I have to show you guys something hilarious," she said, her voice dripping with malicious glee. "Remember when Tyler brought his mother to our engagement party at the club?" She held up her phone, and the group crowded around to look. I couldn't see what was on the screen from my hiding spot, but their reactions told me everything I needed to know. Oh my God! Is she actually talking to the waitstaff like they're friends? Can you believe she's been wearing the same dress to all of the events? Her hair and everything, she looks like she's in her 80s. And what is that necklace she's wearing? It's probably plastic, right?
Tyler's expression turned genuinely cruel then. Something about how marriage is about supporting each other through difficult times, about how love means accepting people for who they are. Real Hallmark card stuff. Meanwhile, Amanda's marrying into the Richardson fortune, and love has nothing to do with it. The irony, Penelope added, is that she's giving advice about accepting people for who they are when she can't even accept that Tyler has outgrown her world. She keeps trying to pull him back into her middle-class mentality. Middle-class mentality. As if having values, showing kindness to service workers, and caring about something other than social status was a character defect to be overcome. "You know what the real problem is?" Tyler continued, and I leaned closer, despite myself, morbidly curious to hear how my own son would diagnose my failings. "She thinks that because she sacrificed for me, I owe her something. Like her choices somehow obligate me to limit my own potential." "That's so manipulative," Rebecca agreed, "using guilt to control your decisions." Manipulative, guilt, control. They were describing my love, my sacrifice, my 28 years of single motherhood as if it had been a calculated campaign to hold him back rather than everything I'd done to lift him up. That's when I realized I was crying, but not from sadness. These weren't tears of hurt or betrayal. They were tears of rage, pure, crystalline fury at the realization that I had spent decades enabling the creation of a monster. I thought about the nights I'd stayed up helping him with homework while working 2 jobs, the vacations I'd never taken so he could go on school trips, the dreams I'd deferred, the relationships I'd sacrificed, the pieces of myself I'd given away bit by bit until there was nothing left but Tyler's success. And this was what I'd created. A man who saw kindness as weakness, sacrifice as manipulation, and love as an obligation to be minimized. But then, Penelope said something that pushed me over the edge entirely. "The funniest part is that she actually thinks we're going to use her money for a house down payment," she said, examining her manicured nails. "When really it's going straight into our honeymoon fund. 2 weeks in Bali, first class, everything. We figured we deserved it after having to deal with Tyler's family situation." Family situation. $25,000 of my retirement savings. Money I'd saved by eating peanut butter sandwiches for lunch and buying my clothes at secondhand stores was being spent on a luxury vacation while they laughed about my stupidity. That's when I stepped out from behind the column. "Tyler?" I said quietly, my voice cutting through their laughter like a blade. The entire group froze. Tyler's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, guilt, calculation, and finally, irritation. "Mom, I thought you'd left," he said, straightening his tie. "I was about to," I replied, walking closer to the group. But then I heard the most interesting conversation. Penelope had the grace to look slightly embarrassed, but Tyler's expression hardened. "How long were you standing there?" "Long enough," I said simply. "Long enough to understand exactly what kind of man I raised.
long enough to hear about your honeymoon plans, long enough to see those photographs. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. "Mom, look," Tyler began, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd heard him use with difficult clients. "I know some of that probably sounded harsh, but you have to understand—" "Oh, I understand perfectly," I interrupted, reaching into my purse. The same checkbook I'd used to write him the $25,000 check just hours earlier. "But most importantly, I understand that I've been enabling your transformation into someone I don't recognize and definitely don't respect." Tyler's face went pale as he realized what I was about to do. "Mom, don't do anything rash. We can talk about this." "We're done talking, Tyler," I said, my pen moving across the check with deliberate precision. "We've been done talking for a long time. I just didn't realize it till now." What happened next would shock them all, but none more than myself, because in that moment, standing in that perfectly manicured garden, surrounded by people who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to be managed, I finally remembered who Dorothy Brennan really was. And she was nobody's fool. I wrote the check with steady hands, my pen moving across the paper with the same precision I'd used to build my catering business from nothing. $25,000, made out to the Riverside Children's Hospital in memory of Robert Brennan, my late husband who would have been ashamed of what his son had become. Tyler's face went from pale to ashen as he watched me tear the check from my book and fold it carefully into my purse. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm making sure my money goes to people who understand its value. Children fighting for their lives tend to appreciate generosity more than adults planning luxury vacations."
Penelope stepped forward, her bridal composure finally cracking. "You can't just take back a wedding gift. That's not how this works." "You're absolutely right," I agreed, "which is why I'm not taking back your wedding gift. I'm redirecting my charitable donation. You see, when you told me you needed money for a house down payment, you were asking for help with an investment in your future. But since you're actually spending it on a vacation, that makes it a luxury expense. And I don't fund luxury expenses for people who mock my kindness." The mathematical precision of my logic seemed to catch Tyler off guard. He always underestimated my intelligence, assuming that because I'd chosen catering over college, I somehow lacked the ability to think strategically. But running a business for 28 years teaches you a thing or two about reading people and protecting your interests. "Mom, please," Tyler said, his lawyer training finally kicking in. "Let's go somewhere private and discuss this rationally. There's been a misunderstanding." "There's been no misunderstanding," I replied, looking around at the group of people who'd been laughing at my expense moments earlier. They were all staring at me now with a mixture of shock and fascination, probably wondering if this was the most dramatic thing they'd ever witness at a society wedding. "I heard every word you said. I saw the photographs on Penelope's phone. I understand the situation perfectly." James Ashworth, who'd been notably quiet since my arrival, finally found his voice. "Mrs. Brennan, I think we all got a bit carried away with the wedding excitement. You know how these things can get, people saying things they don't really mean." I turned to face him directly, this young man who'd called me common not 5 minutes earlier. "Mr. Ashworth, in my experience, alcohol doesn't create new thoughts. It just removes the filter that usually keeps people from expressing their true feelings. Your sister and my son weren't drunk on champagne when they planned to deceive me about that money. They were just drunk on their own sense of superiority." Penelope's face flushed red. "How dare you speak to my family that way? We welcomed you into our celebration, and this is how you repay our hospitality?" The audacity of her statement was breathtaking. "Welcomed me?" I laughed, and the sound was sharper than I had intended.
You relegated me to the third row of my own wedding sun. You excluded me from family photographs. You revoked my +1 invitation. You told your friends I was an embarrassment to be managed. If that's your definition of hospitality, I'd hate to see how you treat your enemies. Tyler stepped between us, his face a mask of controlled panic. Mom, you're embarrassing yourself. Everyone's watching. Everyone's watching, I repeated slowly. You're right, Tyler. Everyone is watching. And what they're seeing is a mother who finally refused to enable her son's transformation into someone she doesn't recognize. I looked around at the small crowd that had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Wedding guests in their expensive clothes, holding their crystal champagne flutes, witnessing what was probably the first genuine emotion they had seen all day. Some looked uncomfortable, others seemed fascinated by the drama. A few appeared sympathetic, as if they recognized something familiar in my situation. But you know what, Tyler? I continued, my voice growing stronger. I'm not embarrassed. I'm liberated. For the first time in years, I'm saying exactly what I think instead of what you want to hear. Christopher Montgomery, the groomsman who'd praised Tyler's brilliant strategy for managing me, cleared his throat nervously. Maybe we should all take a step back and cool down. This is getting a bit intense. I turned to him with a smile that felt surprisingly genuine. Mr. Montgomery, you're the one who complimented Tyler on his brilliant strategy for neutralizing his embarrassing relatives. Tell me, which part of that strategy are you recommending he implement now? The silence that followed was deafening. Christopher's face went through several shades of red as he realized he'd heard every word of his earlier commentary. That's when Tyler made his crucial mistake. Instead of apologizing, instead of acknowledging the hurt he had caused, he doubled down on his position. Fine, Mom, you want to know the truth? Yes, we were going to use your money for our honeymoon. Yes, I asked you to come for the ceremony only because having you at the reception would have been awkward for our guests. And yes, I've been trying to create some distance between us because, frankly, you don't fit into the world Penelope and I are building together. The honesty was brutal, but it was also clarifying. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a moment of poor judgment. This was Tyler's authentic position, delivered with the cold precision of a closing argument. Thank you, I said quietly. Thank you for finally being honest with me. He looked confused by my calm response. So you understand why things had to be this way? Oh, I understand completely. I understand that you've become someone who values appearances over authenticity, wealth over character, and status over family. I understand that you see my love as a burden and my presence as an embarrassment. Most importantly, I understand that I played a role in creating this situation by teaching you that my needs were always secondary to yours.
I paused, looking at my son's face, searching for any trace of the boy I'd raised. But here's what you don't understand, Tyler. You seem to think that cutting me out of your life is something you're doing to me. But actually, it's something you're doing to yourself. You're choosing to disconnect from the only person who ever loved you unconditionally, who celebrated your achievements without expecting anything in return, who saw your potential before you even knew you had any. Penelope stepped closer to Tyler, a gesture of solidarity that looked more possessive than supportive. Tyler doesn't need lectures about family from someone who couldn't even maintain a marriage. The attack was so unexpected, so deliberately cruel, that it took my breath away for a moment. She was referring to Robert's death, turning my widowhood into a personal failure. But instead of crushing me, her words ignited something I hadn't felt in years. You're right, Penelope, I said, my voice deadly calm. I couldn't maintain my marriage. Death has a way of disrupting even the best relationships. But let me tell you something about the marriage I had with Robert. It was built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine love. Can you say the same about what you're building with Tyler? I looked directly at her, then at Tyler. Because from what I observe today, your relationship seems to be built on shared snobbery, mutual deception, and a joint commitment to looking down on anyone you consider beneath you. That's not a foundation for a marriage. That's a foundation for a business arrangement. Tyler's jaw tightened. You don't know anything about our relationship. I know that you lied to your bride about where my money was going. I know that you both spent months planning how to minimize my presence at your wedding while maximizing my financial contribution. I know that you collect photographs of people you claim to care about for the sole purpose of mocking them later. If that's love, Tyler, then I'm grateful I never learned your definition of it. The wedding photographer appeared at the edge of our group, his camera hanging uncertainly at his side. "Excuse me," he said hesitantly, "but the bride's parents are asking for you both, for the family photos." Tyler looked at the photographer, then back at me, clearly torn between continuing our confrontation and fulfilling his social obligations. "Go," I said, simply. "Take your family photos. Celebrate your new life with your new family. I'll be leaving now." "Mom, wait," Tyler said, and for a moment his voice carried a trace of the uncertainty I remembered from his childhood. "We can't just leave things like this." I studied his face, looking for genuine remorse, for any sign that the man he'd become could still access the boy he'd been. But what I saw instead was calculation. He wasn't concerned about our relationship. He was concerned about the spectacle we'd created, about the gossip that would follow this confrontation through Penelope's social circle. Actually, Tyler, we can leave things exactly like this. In fact, I think this is the most honest conversation we've had in years. You've told me exactly where I stand in your life, and I've responded accordingly. There's nothing left to discuss. I reached into my purse and pulled out the wedding gift envelope he had handed back to me during our confrontation. "You should keep this," I said, offering it to him. "Not for the money. There isn't any money in there anymore. But as a reminder." Tyler took the envelope with trembling hands. "A reminder of what?" "Of the day you chose to prioritize other people's opinions over your mother's love. Of the day you discovered that unconditional love actually does have conditions, and you violated every single one of them." I turned to walk away, but Penelope's voice stopped me. "This isn't over, Dorothy. Tyler is still my husband, which makes you family whether you like it or not. We'll be in touch." I turned back to face her, this beautiful young woman who thought family was something that could be managed and manipulated like a business merger. "No, Penelope, you won't be in touch, because family isn't a legal designation. It's not something you acquire through marriage documents or social contracts. Family is built through love, respect, and mutual support. And since you've made it clear that those things don't exist between us, we have nothing to build on." I looked at Tyler one last time. "I hope your new life brings you everything you think you want. But I suspect you're going to discover that a world without unconditional love is a much lonelier place than you imagined." As I walked away from that perfectly manicured garden, leaving behind the wreckage of a relationship I'd spent 28 years building, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades: complete honesty with myself about who I was and what I deserved. The photographs scattered across my car seat weren't evidence of my humiliation anymore. They were proof that I'd finally stopped accepting treatment that fell short of my worth. And that realization was worth more than any wedding gift I could have given.
6 months have passed since that afternoon at the Willowbrook Country Club, and I'm writing this from my new apartment in downtown Asheville. Yes, I moved. After 28 years in the same house in Maplewood, I packed up my life and started over at 71 years old, and I've never been happier. The decision to relocate came 3 weeks after the wedding, when I realized that staying in a town where everyone knew about Tyler's rejection would mean living under a constant cloud of pity and speculation. Maplewood is small enough that the story of Dorothy Brennan's dramatic exit from her son's wedding had become local legend, growing more elaborate with each retelling. Some versions painted me as the vengeful mother who couldn't let go. Others cast me as the tragic figure abandoned by an ungrateful child. A few people understood that what they'd witnessed was actually a woman finally claiming her own worth, but they were in the minority. Mrs. Henderson from the grocery store had cornered me 2 weeks after the wedding, her eyes bright with curiosity disguised as concern. "Dorothy, dear, how are you holding up? I heard about the unfortunate misunderstanding at Tyler's reception." Misunderstanding. As if the fundamental incompatibility between my values and my son's behavior could be resolved with a simple clarification. "I'm doing very well, thank you," I had replied, loading my groceries with deliberate efficiency. "No misunderstanding at all, actually. Everything is exactly as clear as it needs to be." But it was the well-meaning sympathy that proved hardest to bear. The clients who booked my catering services and then spent the entire consultation trying to convince me that family is everything and he'll come around eventually. The assumption that I was suffering, that I needed their advice on how to repair a relationship I'd finally recognized as irreparably damaged. After the fourth conversation with someone who insisted that all mothers and sons go through difficult patches, I made the decision to sell everything and start fresh somewhere Tyler had never been, where no one knew our history, where I could simply be Dorothy Brennan instead of that poor woman whose son embarrassed her at his own wedding. The sale of my house in Maplewood brought more than I'd expected. The real estate market had improved dramatically, and what I'd considered my modest 3-bedroom home turned out to be prime property for young families moving out of the city. Combined with the proceeds from selling my catering business to Maria Santos, my longtime assistant who dreamed of ownership for years, I found myself with enough money to truly start over. Asheville chose me as much as I chose it. During my house hunting trip, I'd stopped at a small cafe near the University District and overheard the owner complaining to her manager about the catering company that had just canceled their monthly wine tasting events contract. "Excuse me," I interrupted politely. "I couldn't help but overhear. I'm a caterer, recently relocated from Maplewood. Would you be interested in discussing a replacement arrangement?" 3 hours later, I'd walked out with my first contract in my new city. By the end of the week, I'd secured a small apartment with large windows and good light, perfect for the art studio I'd always wanted but never had space for. The transformation wasn't just geographical. For the first time in decades, I was making decisions based solely on what I wanted, not what Tyler needed or expected. I bought bright red curtains instead of the neutral tones Tyler had always preferred when he visited. I adopted a cat from the local shelter, something I'd always wanted but avoided because Tyler was allergic. I enrolled in watercolor classes at the community college and discovered I had a natural talent for landscape painting. Most surprisingly, I began dating. Harold Fitzgerald, a recently widowed professor of English literature, approached me at a gallery opening where 2 of my paintings were being displayed. He was charming, well-read, and completely unimpressed by social status or wealth. Our first conversation lasted 4 hours, covering everything from Victorian poetry to the challenges of starting over in your 70s. "You know," Harold had said as we shared dessert on our third date, "there's something remarkably attractive about a woman who knows her own worth. It's rarer than it should be." I thought about that comment for days afterwards. Knowing your own worth. Had I ever really known mine before that afternoon at Tyler's wedding? Or had I spent so many years defining myself through my relationship with my son that I'd forgotten who Dorothy Brennan actually was? The answer came unexpectedly during my first major catering event in Asheville. The Riverside University Alumni Association had hired me for their annual fundraising gala, a sophisticated affair for 300 guests. As I supervised the final preparations, I realized I felt completely at ease in this environment of educated, accomplished people.
Not because I was trying to impress anyone or prove my worthiness, but because I finally understood that my worth wasn't dependent on their approval. During the cocktail hour, I found myself in conversation with Dr. Rebecca Chen, the university's chancellor, about the challenges of building institutional culture while maintaining academic excellence. She listened to my insights about managing teams and creating memorable experiences with genuine interest, never once asking what my educational background was or questioning my credentials to have opinions on complex topics.
You have an impressive understanding of organizational dynamics, she'd commented. Have you considered consulting work? We're always looking for people who understand both the operational and emotional sides of large-scale event management. 6 months ago, Tyler had been embarrassed by my tendency to engage service workers in friendly conversation. Now, university chancellors were asking for my professional advice. The difference wasn't in my capabilities, which had always been substantial. The difference was in my willingness to let those capabilities be seen without apologizing for them. The healing process wasn't without its difficult moments. 3 months after I had moved to Asheville, Tyler had called me, not to apologize, but to inform me that he and Penelope were expecting their first child. "I thought you should know you're going to be a grandmother," he'd said, his voice carefully neutral. The news should have brought joy, but instead it brought a profound sadness for the relationship that would never be. "Congratulations," I'd replied sincerely. "I hope you'll be the kind of father your child deserves." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I hope you'll love your child for who they are, not for who you need them to be in order to feel good about yourself." The silence that followed lasted so long, I thought he might have hung up. Finally, Tyler spoke again, his voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. "Mom, do you think there's any chance we could try to work things out? For the baby's sake?" For the baby's sake. Not because he missed me, not because he regretted his behavior, not because he'd gained any insight into the damage he'd caused, but because having a grandmother might be useful for his child, just as having my financial support had been useful for his wedding. "Tyler," I said gently, "I would love nothing more than to have a relationship with my grandchild, but not at the expense of my own dignity. If you want me in your life, it has to be because you value me as a person, not because you need me to fulfill a role." "But we're family," he'd protested, falling back on the same argument that had kept me trapped in our dysfunctional dynamic for years. "Family is a verb, not a noun," I'd replied, borrowing a phrase I'd heard in one of my counseling sessions. "It's something you do, not something you are. And what you've been doing for the past several years is systematically excluding me from your life while expecting me to remain available for whatever you might need from me. So that's it? You're just going to cut us off completely?" "I'm not cutting you off, Tyler. I'm simply refusing to accept a relationship based on your convenience rather than mutual respect. When you're ready to treat me as an equal partner in our relationship instead of a resource to be managed, my door is open. But until then, I have a life to live that doesn't revolve around waiting for you to decide I'm worth your genuine attention." He hung up without saying goodbye, and I haven't heard from him since. I'd like to say that doesn't hurt, but it does. Not because I regret my decision, but because I grieve for the son I thought I'd raised and the relationship I thought we'd had. But that grief no longer defines my days. Instead, my life is filled with new friendships, creative pursuits, and the quiet satisfaction of work that challenges and fulfills me. I've discovered that starting over at 71 isn't just possible, it's liberating in ways I never could have imagined. Last week, Harold and I drove to the mountains to paint watercolors of the autumn foliage. As I set up my easel beside a small stream, I thought about the woman I'd been 6 months ago. The woman who would have spent that beautiful Saturday afternoon cleaning house and preparing elaborate meals for a son who saw her efforts as evidence of her limitations rather than expressions of her love. "You look peaceful," Harold observed, mixing colors on his palette. "I am peaceful," I replied, surprised by how true that statement was. For the first time in years, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be.
That evening, as we sat on my small balcony, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the sunset, Harold asked me something that made me think. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd stood up to Tyler years ago, before things got so bad? I considered the question carefully. Sometimes, I admitted, but I think the truth is that I wasn't ready to stand up to him until I was finally more disappointed in him than I was afraid of losing him. And now? Now I understand that some relationships can only survive if both people are willing to grow. Tyler wanted me to stay exactly who I'd always been, accommodating, self-sacrificing, grateful for whatever scraps of attention he was willing to give me. But I wanted him to become the kind of man who could love without conditions and give without keeping score. I paused, watching the last light fade from the sky. The tragedy isn't that we couldn't both get what we wanted. The tragedy is that he'll probably never understand what he lost when he chose status over authenticity, appearances over love.
Harold reached over and took my hand. "His loss," he said simply. "My gain." As I write this, I can hear my neighbor, Mrs. Valdez, practicing piano through the thin walls of our apartment building. She's 78 and just started taking lessons, pursuing a dream she'd deferred for 50 years while raising her family. Yesterday, she told me that her children think she's having a senior moment by starting something so challenging at her age. "Let them think what they want," she said with a laugh. "I'm not living my life for their approval anymore." I understood exactly what she meant. Because here's what I've learned in these past 6 months. It's never too late to choose yourself. It's never too late to stop accepting treatment that diminishes your worth. And it's never too late to discover that the life you thought you were supposed to want might be completely different from the life that actually makes you happy. Tyler may never call again. I may never meet my grandchild. Those possibilities still cause me pain. But they no longer cause me panic, because I finally learned the difference between loneliness and solitude, between being alone and being abandoned, between sacrifice and self-destruction. I am Dorothy Brennan. I am 71 years old. I am an artist, a businesswoman, a friend, and a partner to someone who sees my strength as attractive rather than threatening. I am exactly who I was always meant to be once I stopped trying to be who everyone else needed me to be. And if you're reading this story wondering whether you have the courage to choose yourself over a relationship that requires you to be smaller than you are, let me tell you this: you do. The courage was always there. Sometimes you just need to get angry enough to use it. Coming up next, you'll see 2 more stories we handpicked just for you. If this one struck a chord, you're going to love what's next. Tap to keep the journey going.